All right. Well, thanks everyone for those beautiful introductions. It really is an honor to be here with so many brothers and sisters from all around the world. I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker and then turn it over to him for our remarks. And also wanted to say, again, a special thanks to all of our Israeli guests from Reichman University. And thank you again for making the journey here. So Dr. Jeffrey Gedmin is the interim president and CEO of the Middle East Broadcasting Network. He's also the co-founder, alongside Francis Fukuyama, of the American Purpose, which is a nonpartisan, international, multi-platform media venture dedicated to the defense and future of liberal democracy. Jeffrey has served as the president and CEO of London-based Legatum Institute, the Aspen Institute Berlin, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, headquartered in Prague, Czech Republic. Before assignments in Europe, Gedmin spent 10 years at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, in Washington, D.C., where he was a resident scholar and executive director of the New Atlantic Initiative. He's the author of The Hidden Hand, Gorbachev and the Collapse of East Germany. He served as a co-executive producer for two major PBS documentaries about the Germans and Spain's 9/11 and radical Islam in Europe. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on several boards, including the Institute for State Effectiveness, the Justice for Journalists Foundation, the Paris-based Tocqueville Conversations, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Together with former U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic, Norm Eisen, he's the co-chair of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which is based at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and directed by Jonathan Katz. He holds a BA in music, a master's in German literature, and a PhD from Georgetown University in German Area Studies. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having me. Take this. So thank you, Jack. Thank you very much. And Shmuley. I'm mic'd. So, Jack, thank you. And Shmuley and Toby, nice to meet you in person. Thank you all for having me. It's a privilege and honor to be here. Now, first, let me give you my unofficial bio, okay? So I'm from Washington, D.C., grew up in Northern Virginia, in Vienna, Virginia, and went to a public school named James Madison High School. I didn't spend a lot of time in school during high school. I spent time doing extracurricular activities, including a lot of music, Mitchell. And so I went through these phases when I was 15, 16, 17, 18. I owned every guitar you could imagine, every dobro you could imagine, every banjo you can imagine, every mandolin you can imagine, through rock and folk and bluegrass and so forth, and was determined to make a career in music without going to college, which was a big conflict with my parents. And so we did a deal, which was try 1 year of music, college, and then you can quit, and that's okay. And of course, I went and I didn't stop going to school somehow along the way. So indeed, I did a bachelor's degree. I mean, the story of this is not, the story could be that I can't hold a job or I have no attention span, but it could be that life is really not linear. You know, you think it is, and you think A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D. Sometimes for some people, but for most of us, it really doesn't. So I did an undergraduate degree in music, okay? Studied for a year in Austria, in Salzburg, great place to study, and then realized that Mitchell's going to be a conductor, right? Or studying and endeavoring and striving toward that. And then I realized that I was quite a failed musician. And of course, for classical music, if you want to do things like piano, as they say, you have to start playing Haydn in the womb. And then practice 13 hours a day, every day. That was not for me. So I did music as an undergraduate. After a year in Austria, I was bitten by a different bug, you know, Germany, German history, German language, culture, German music, of course. So I came back to the United States, did a master's degree in German literature, and thought, now I really want to be a literature professor. Could there be anything better than that? So I went to Georgetown University, got a PhD in German history and linguistics. During the day, you got to make a living. I taught in a high school in Washington, D.C., a Jesuit, Catholic Jesuit boys' school called Gonzaga College High School. That's why it took me 7 years to do my dissertation. But I did that. But by that time, I was on to something very different. And that was politics, public policy, and foreign policy. And so I go fast forward. I finished my PhD. I hustled and got a job as a research assistant in a so-called think tank in Washington, D.C. called American Enterprise Institute. And I found out quickly, if you want to do anything in this business, you've got to write, you've got to publish, help if you raise money and organize conferences and so forth. And I did that for a number of years. And then all of a sudden, funny things started happening to me. Life is not linear. I speed it up, but you should know you're dealing with a rather eclectic person who is really mile wide, inch deep. You'll find that out very quickly here. But then I'm in Washington, D.C., in this Washington, D.C. think tank, and the phone rings, and the fellow on the other end says, I'm the CFO of Daimler Chrysler in Germany, but that's not why I'm calling. I'm the chairman of an institute in Berlin, and I want to know if you want to be the director of it. I said, absolutely not. I mean, I'm here. Why do I want to move to Berlin? And I'm here, and I'm happy, and what think tank? And didn't make sense. And so he said, look, I'm coming to New York in 2 weeks. Would you just come up and have dinner with me? I said, sure, but I don't want to lead you on because I'm really planted here. So then I went to Berlin, of course. And I said, this is going to be good for 2 years, right? So I stayed for 5 years. And then, privileged, because we all like being flattered, I was headhunted to run a U.S. congressionally media company called Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, based in Prague. And there, too, I said, well, you know, thank you. I'm ready to go back to the United States. I miss America. So I went to Prague. I took that job, and I stayed for 4.5 years because I loved it. Everything I've done, I've been privileged, and I love. And then once again, I was coming back to the United States, and I got sidetracked, and I went to London to run an institute there for a little bit over 3 years. Came back to the United States, set up this magazine that you mentioned with this political scientist named Francis Fukuyama, if you know that name at all, teaches at Stanford right now. And then life kept happening to me. I'll get to the point in a moment. I was drafted out of the blue to go back to Prague last fall. Again, it wasn't practical because I have a partner and she teaches here and we have a dog. But, you know, drafted and went back to Prague as the interim president of this Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, June to January, because they needed someone in the interim role. And then finally, to what Shmuley mentioned, I'm kind of minding my own business in Washington, D.C., and in April I get a call. It's great to get calls, by the way. I get a call from a fellow named Ryan Crocker, who's a retired American diplomat. He was U.S. ambassador to Syria, Kuwait, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and he says, I'm on this board of something called Middle East Broadcasting Networks. It's Arabic language, it's linear television, it's digital, it's based in the Washington, D.C. area, bureaus across Northern Africa, Middle East. And he said, it's really badly broken. I mean, really neglected and badly broken. Would you come in and work on fixing it? And of course, you know, it's good for your self-esteem when someone like that calls you and they think that you can fix it. And I'm there, and it's really badly broken. And we're working to fix it. That's who I am. A little bit longer, but you know, a little bit background. Let me give you a handful of remarks, kind of scene setting, and then I hope we can have a good conversation about America, Israel, and the world. First thing I want to say in introduction is it seems to me that we really, it sounds trite to say this, but it seems to me that we really do now live in what? An age of surprise and an era of improbability. And when I tell you this in bullet form, it's age of surprise, an era of improbability. And when I tell you this in bullet form, you'll say, well, yeah, it's kind of obvious. But it wasn't obvious a very short time ago. So imagine in a relatively short time, Brexit, remember? Donald J. Trump, right? Global pandemic. If you step back, 9/11. If you step back forward, January 6th, October 7th. I'll even say Kamala Harris. I'll even say that it's so close. in this election right now. On the eve of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I hosted sequentially two of the top generals in the United States of America who with full conviction said, he's not doing that and here are the reasons why. He's doing this and that and the other, but he's not invading full scale. This, that, and the other reason why. And then you remember when he did, all the experts had a lot of knowledge. This war is over in a week. Do you remember that? This war is over in a week, and here we are. It's also a period, if you think about it, where weirdly the seemingly marginal has become mainstream and massively disruptive. You watch the news, you follow the news of the Houthis, Iran-backed, in Yemen, and they attacked these vessels in the Red Sea. Do you know when they started attacking vessels in the Red Sea? 2015. It's almost a decade ago. And if you count, in the last year, 83 vessels have been attacked, disrupting international trade, affecting the freedom of navigation. It's remarkable. So if you put all this together, in my view, the rapidity of change, the frequency of surprise leads to this moment where I think we start to lose perspective and compass. I think. There's an art historian at Harvard named Jennifer Roberts. I don't know if she still does this, but she used to do this. It's a fantastic exercise. She has her students go to an art gallery to sit with any work of art of their choice, ready, for 3 hours. Mad. You know, what? You know, I would get a little nervous myself, I have to admit. 3 hours. And first, the fidgeting, no devices, by the way, right? Off and all that. They can have a notebook and a pen, and each and every one finds, which is the purpose of the exercise, that if you sit with it and you concentrate and you take a deep breath and you follow that paint, if it's a painting, you discover things that you can't see or understand at first glance. We think that at first glance you capture it all, but you don't. You capture one dimension, maybe. So it's an interesting exercise. I think we live in a moment now where we're magnificent in detail, but we lose the big picture and the perspective. I think we live in a moment where we're masters of transaction, but we're falling way short, as you and I discussed before dinner or during dinner, fall way short on purpose and meaning. And I think it's that moment, civilizationally, metaphorically, where we need to find ways to activate, if I may put it this way, both hemispheres of the brain. Not one versus the other, but integrated in line, both hemispheres of the brain. It's my own view that when we look back on this point in American history, my view, no historian will say, you know what, they really lacked IQ points. They just weren't working hard enough, more industriousness. You know what, America lost its ambition as a nation. I don't think that's it at all. I think we're missing something else, which is hard to describe, difficult to quantify, but fits under the rubric of empathy, humility, wisdom, judgment. It's not those other. Now, how do you train for that, or how do you teach that? Well, you can tell me tonight how you work on all those things. So with that said, let me make 3 points about America, Israel, and the world, then we open up for discussion, okay? Point number 1, in the United States, we concentrate, and understandably, on the people and the personalities, and we should, because they matter greatly. But I think something deeper, more cultural, and more structural is afoot, and that makes it harder to tackle and manage and change. I give you this example. If you go back to 2016 and the American primaries, the 2 candidates that fared best were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And people say to me, well, they have nothing in common. But they do in one respect. They were the 2 candidates who ran against the establishment, ran against elites, ran against the status quo, ran against, respectively, Washington and Wall Street. And I think, you like him or dislike him, it said something. It was a revealing moment of a problem in our politics, with our mainstream parties, and with the way the country was and is being run. If you look back before Bernie and Donald Trump, from the political science of it, voter ties have been loosening to our mainstream parties for some time, actually. That's structural, and I think that's important to observe. It's not just the United States, it's across the democratic West world. In a country like Germany, okay? Everybody talks about the AfD, right, the right-wing populist party, and they should, okay? But the voter ties have been loosening in Germany to the mainstream parties for some years now. And so what happens? When the establishment fails or weakens, when the center fails or weakens, vacuums occur and vacuums get filled. And now from right-wing and left-wing populist leaders and parties. Second point I want to make is, if this is a reflection on what's happening inside the United States and other democracies, I think if you look broadly around the globe, world order, if I may put it that way, is fraying too. So I paint in broad brush strokes, but again, vacuums and nature. America, in relative terms, has started stepping back. I think it goes back to President Obama. I'm an equal opportunity criticizer, if I may say. America steps back. Well, what happens? Vacuums get created, and now others step forward, notably China, notably Iran, and notably Vladimir Putin's Russia. Most of, in my view, foreign policy, kind of like life, if I may say, but most of foreign policy involves navigating ambiguity. It's just not so simple. It's not so black and white. You have to wrestle with dilemmas. However, I think there are moments in history where things become relatively clear. And I believe, I can't prove it to you, but I believe that we're in one of those relatively clear moments where there's a struggle between the liberal world and world order and those who want spheres of influence, and between those who believe broadly in liberalism and those who believe in different brands and different shapes and shades of authoritarianism. And I think if you look at what's happening now, it's a very unfortunate confluence of events that brings us to a big moment. It has to do with technology. It has to do with fragmentation. It has to do with America, in my view, in relative terms, turning inward. And it has to do with Israel, as I said, in my view, being a key part of the front line of freedom. And it manifests itself in so many ways, but it's also a surprise, and to me, a profoundly disappointing one, that in my view, Israel now is under attack from so many different sources. Maybe it was always the case, but I don't know it to be quite this case. A story, and then to the close, because I want to say something about the Middle East broadcasting networks. The story is, 2 weeks ago, I was at Duke University giving a talk to students, and they described themselves as moderate, progressive liberals. And after talking to them and spending the evening with them, this was not left-wing or Marxist or radical. It was just what they said, moderate, liberal, progressives. Then they told me that they had gone, some of them, they had gone to a campus protest for Gaza or for Palestine, whatever language you want to use. And they said, well, we don't have our iPhone with us, we don't have a camera with us. But they said, we went out there and we saw the students displaying banners that were anti-Semitic and pro-terrorist. They said, like blatantly, brazenly, explicitly. And then when they went up to take pictures, photos, the students turned the banners around to something more innocuous, whatever that was. And then they were shooed away by the people protesting. And then I said, were these folks, these were undergrads I was talking to, I said, were they coming from on campus or off campus? On campus. And I said, were they Palestinian or non-Palestinian? They said, no, 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 they were all Americans, undergraduates, we go to class with them. I said, really? Openly anti-Semitic and pro-terrorist? It is very jarring. So, finally, where do I work right now? You have to have someone said optimism, hope, everybody said hope about Israel. You have to, in this world, you have to be a pathological optimist. Why else are we here, Manage problems, make things better. I work now for this group called the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. It's congressionally funded. It is journalistically independent. I can tell you more about it. It is linear television and digital, Northern Africa, Middle East, Arabic language. And here's what surprised me. I told you about surprise and improbability, and now I'm there 4.5 months on the job, and virtually meeting with people on the ground. The bureaus outside Washington, we have 500 people. Journalists, editors, producers, technicians, and so forth. You know what's really surprised me is the following. I'm generalizing, okay? I'm generalizing. You know what they think? They don't think like a lot of students on American campuses, if I may say. They think that Iran is the enemy. They think that America is the ally. They think that Israel is not the enemy. They think that Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis are terrorist organizations. And you know what they think about the United States? This is a select group. This is impressionistic. This isn't, the entire region. They think the United States is a place of inspiration and hope. And any time I try to play devil's advocate, because the streets are not paved with gold and not everybody gets everything they want, they always say to me, compared to what? Try living in Egypt right now. So it is kind of compared to what? So, Jack, Shmuley, everybody, thank you. Happy to have a conversation. Okay.
As Shmuley said, part of the topic of this evening is both law and technology. And I'm wondering how, as a media company, you're dealing with sort of this new rash of sort of fake news, deep fakes, AI, this feeling that we all have that in a couple years, when we hear the news, when we see the news, when we hear things associated with the news, we'll have no clue as to whether or not anything is real anymore. Anything can be concretely seen as something that we can trust. So how do you as a news organization, think about dealing with this, actually deal with this, and where do you see, your role in sort of dealing with this?
Thank you. So that's a great question. I do not have a very strong and compelling answer. First of all, so I'll tell you what I think, but I don't have a good answer. To those who provide state, non-state actors, fake news, disinformation, all that, I'm a great skeptic of combating and countering it, because it's like putting your finger in the holes of it springs out everywhere. You run yourself ragged, So there's a temptation to do that. I understand that. I don't think it's entirely wrong-headed, but that can't be the answer, because it's a tsunami now coming at us from all sources. Lies, manipulation, mischaracterization, and so forth. First observation. Second observation is, where is this successful, whether it's here or abroad? The disinformation, propaganda, disinformation, it's virtually always successful when the soil is fertile. So generally speaking, if I'm walking along the street and I'm educated at Yale or your university outside of Tel Aviv, I'm not just susceptible to wild nonsense because the wild nonsense was so well presented. It has some sort of resonance. I'll give you an example, back to Ukraine. I had a student at Georgetown, taught at Georgetown for a little bit, student at Georgetown who taught, before the war, English in a small village in East Ukraine. Okay? I can't tell you where, but somewhere. And he tells me the following story. He says, you know, I was befriending, it was an ethnic Russian village. He said, I was befriending people, and we're playing in a band, and drinking beer, and socializing, and all this. And then, when the war began, everything flipped, and they wanted to go off and fight, and everything flipped, and all of a sudden, the United States was a perpetrator of genocide, and he said, all the friendships broke. So why do I tell you that? There must have been something dormant there. It wasn't just they tuned in one day to RT, you know, Russian propaganda. Oh, that's very convincing. You know, America is perpetrator of genocide. I think Putin was very, and is very good at tapping into grievance or something that he knows how to manipulate very, effectively. If I may say, I don't know what your politics are, let them be varied. Donald J. Trump, in my view, is a demagogic figure, and he knows, he walks into the room, he smells grievance. He knows exactly there, and he knows exactly how to play that. And by the way, not all grievance is illegitimate, you know, because he knows, one knows that we had Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, people who didn't turn out on the winning side of globalization and free trade and other things. And there's legitimate frustration or disappointment in Washington, Wall Street, elites, cosmopolitans. We're all cosmopolitans here. And he knows how to play that. Putin knows how to play that. Where am I going with that? I think, one, it's hard to combat because it comes from all directions. Two, it's effective where the soil is very fertile. And three, I think we have to do two things and play the long game. It's not a very satisfactory answer. One is we have to believe in truth, accuracy, honesty, truth-seeking, you know, truth-seeking. Have to believe in that. And then somehow, as societies, we have to do a much better job of educating and training discerning consumers. You know, once upon a time, we were great in educating consumers about products. And now, if I get a candy bar or anything, probably here, there's probably a 1-800 number on the Pellegrino bottle. If you have any questions about this bottle of Pellegrino, you know, and here's the social media and this and that and the other. But when we consume media, that's our bodies. When we consume media, we have no idea where it's coming from and who's paying for it. That's going to be part of the solution. But it surely is long term. Who else? What else? Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir, for joining us. Again, my name is Jacob Martin, and I'm a senior at the college. I think one of the themes that I picked up on in your remarks is the concept of education versus re-education. And I'm curious if you see in your current capacity, your current role, if you are a practitioner of education or re-education. And what I mean by that is do you feel that you are dispensing truths that people are sort of encountering for the first time? Or do you see your role as sort of addressing maybe misconceptions? And I'm also curious if you see one as more difficult than the other, education versus addressing misconceptions.
So, Jake, thank you. So this Middle East Broadcasting Networks has a mission. Mission is important. Purpose is important. It does three things. One, it tells the American story. Not propaganda, but the story, journalistically. It's a very complicated country, if you haven't noticed. 333 million people, and all the levels and layers of faith and race and crime and justice and all these things. But it's an interesting country, and there's a way to tell it both accurately and honestly with some measure of respect and affection. So that's one point. Second thing that we do is we cover human rights and governance and civil society issues. Third thing we do is offer audiences an alternative to what the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians do. So those are the three things. And then I'm just going to take the liberty of saying, because I mentioned truth before, do you know who Václav Havel was, right? Playwright, dissident, president of First Free Czechoslovakia in 1990. Havel, 5 years and change in prison, he had this wonderful phrase. He said, always be seeking truth and beware of those who claim they found it. That's kind of interesting, you know, for politics and for journalism. So we're not trying to teach people, sermonize to people, impose on people. My own view is it doesn't work, actually, as a practical matter. And most people in most countries around the world don't want to be dictated to. They want choice and opportunity to make their own judgments. So broadly speaking, I suppose it's a mission that's educating, but not in an imposing, or I would say condescending or a dictating sort of way. It's a journalistic organization. Members of Congress, they fund this, they always ask me, how are you moving the needle this quarter? I said, well, we don't. I know you want that. You know, someone said to me, you know this phrase, it's popular. Where does it come from? I don't know. If it can't be counted, it doesn't count. Well, that can't possibly be true. You know, who wants to live that kind of life or in that kind of nation or society? So this is journalism with a compass, journalism with a purpose, and it's all the long-term stuff. It's investment. So, who else? What else? Yes, sir.
Once again, I'm Timothy Bang. I'm in a third year at Yale College. I really appreciate you sharing about your background. Myself, I'm also, I went to music school for 2 years, quit it, joined the military, was an Arabic linguist for the US military, and I came back to school here. But over the last year, I felt the most disconnect I've ever had with the undergraduate student population nationwide, particularly in their response to what happened on October 7th. I was wondering if you had any perspective on like what role even like media or social media would play, in, especially because these were peers that, you know, I'd respected, I've thought that were very smart, but at the same time, it was the first time where I really felt such a ideological like kind of divide or difference, you know, between their perspectives. So I was wondering if you had any perspective of like how like maybe like TikTok or like maybe modern media might be playing a role, if you had any perspective on that.
So I have an observation and I ask the table a question. So the observation is obviously technology and social media are driving lots and lots of things in our political discourse and perceptions. And as you know, as well as I, the good news about the advent of these new technologies is everybody has a voice. The bad news is everybody has a voice, okay? And what we used to call considered opinion is this dinosaur or, you know, this ancient thing, considered opinion, because now instant opinion is just so, I mean, I see social media and still on cable television, anyway, people I know who know less than I do, and 3 minutes after X, the Fed adjusts interest rates, they're opining on what it actually means. I said, you don't know what it means. We had dinner last night. You're not a financial journalist or economist. I should do that show, and you're doing it 3 minutes after. Well, it means three things, John, and here's why. So the rush to instant opinion and the democratization where we're less and less discerning and everybody's weighing in. Here's my question at the table to you all. For you all, and generationally, so Israel, the United States, how is it that suddenly, I think, I can't quantify it, but more and more younger people, 20-something, 30-something, maybe early 40-something, see, it's not new, but it seems to me accentuated that Israel is the perpetrator, that violence against Israel has to be understood, it's rationalized, it's minimized, that the narratives get flipped because, in my view, what happened on October 7th was inarguably an attack by forces that had genocidal intent and genocidal method, yet suddenly that's been twisted entirely to a reverse narrative. There are seeds of this over years and years, but it strikes me that in the United States of America, more and more younger people now adopt and promote the view that Israel is an imperialist, colonialist, oppressor state, and a violator of human rights. Am I right that it's actually worse than it was 5 or 10 years ago? And if I'm right, what happened and how did we get here? You said yes? Who said yes? Well, then explain why, how so, if you think that's right.
Okay, for me, the short answer is anti-Semitism, and the long.
I don't think the mic is on, actually.
What?
It's actually not on.
It's not amplifying, it's just recording. So you get to speak up and stand
okay.
up, please. Especially when you're talking about colonialism.
Well, I didn't mean, I didn't mean to speak, but okay. The short answer, I think it's anti-Semitism, like it's growing. And for me, the long answer, I think people don't really have like their own point of view of things. They just see something online and they share, and this is their opinion now. So that's it.
You know, we were talking actually over dinner. Oh, sorry. We were talking over dinner, and I did have one just unwarranted, like, just observation, and it's nothing I fleshed out completely, but I felt that in youth, especially in the younger youth, they might, in America in particular, and especially in these academic institutions, there tend to be higher achieving, very ambitious individuals, and I felt like we could almost feel like they are always looking to find something to put their idea, their like young energy behind, you know, whatever movement it might be, and for them, the first one, it happened to be what happened, and anyways.
Anybody else on that? Yes.
I'm going to be an annoying philosophy major for a second and say that I read Husserl's Crisis of Man for a class this morning, and we were discussing it, and I was just, it seemed so prescient and like relevant for this current moment that you're talking about. And he argues that, you know, all of Europe's problems in the 1930s have come from this straying away from rationality, and hearing you talk about, you know, this like dissipation of truth and people having, you know, being soil that's ready to hear this kind of irrational dialogue. I'm just wondering, I don't need you to give a lecture about Husserl, but just sort of these same ideas about, you know, how we strain from rationality and what, you know, how you think that this kind of thing could be remedied. And then also, yeah, just following up on the strands of kind of your perspective on perhaps even the similarities between the current state of things now and perhaps like 1930s-esque state of things. That's a lot of questions, but would love to hear your thoughts.
So let me take 1930s second, and let me ask you another question. Each of these countries are different, but across the West, the liberal democracies, do you have the sense that some people or some parts of our societies are growing tired of liberalism? I don't mean Democratic Party, but liberalism, and that in a search for what, you know, place, community, purpose, identity, they're finding refuge in all sorts of new authoritarian form. I mean, why is it, I'm going to name some people. They're different, okay? But I'm going to suggest that they're cut from a somewhat similar cloth. Vladimir Putin, Turkish leader Erdogan, you're going to say Donald Trump, might even say Bibi Netanyahu. They're all men, by the way. Viktor Orban in Hungary, they're all men. They're all, you can fuss with the language, but they're all consolidators of power. Politicians are always egotistical, but these men tend toward a kind of narcissism, I believe. Different, I'm going to say similar cloth. And yet, in each and every case, they do have followers. You know, they're not operating in a vacuum. They have people who connect, with whom they resonate. So my question at the table is, are more and more people across Western societies, from Israel to France to Germany, the United States, tiring of liberalism and in the search for purpose and meaning, finding refuge in new forms of authoritarianism? People talk about Viktor Orban in Hungary all the time, for example. Orban's a problem, but what about the people who vote for him? I mean, people actually vote for him and support him. They're not in Budapest, by the way. They're in the rural districts. They think Budapest is filled with cosmopolitan, condescending elites, which is not all wrong, but it's interesting. So could someone speak to that? Yes. Well,
This
you're
is
speaking all the
sorry.
time.
I'm so
You
sorry.
can't speak all the
I
time.
will give up this mic.
Well,
Take it
give
away.
up.
Please
You
take
have-
it away
you
from
have 10
me.
seconds.
Oh yes, absolutely. I was going to say, I actually think that you really alluded to that by mentioning disenfranchisement, or like.
You're on
and-
second 9.
Oh, sorry.
You have 1 second left.
Essentially, I feel like it's a natural process that happens when a vacuum is formed
Okay.
and people are seeking power. And people themselves aren't even aware that they're giving away their liberalist ideals. They're just finding ways to attach themselves to something different and new.
Plausible. Who else wants to speak to that who hasn't spoken? Oh, down here. I'll pass it down.
So my name is Shai Shimonov. I'm an applied math PhD student here. I have like a few questions that kind of relate to what you said, and they're all in the same theme. So my first is more, and some of them are a bit controversial. So the first is just a background. It seems like you come from a very eclectic background, knowing Europe, the US, and now the Arab world, which like Europe kind of moved in order for the US to rise, the old world, like the new democracy, and now the more fundamentalism approach that is now clashing in a way, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. And you can also, you're said to be, like basically your work right now is to market democracy in a way in the Middle East. So also kind of relating to October 7, there is a belief that most of the people want democracy. They care about their children, they care about their life, basically, and they don't want an authoritative government or regime. Do you think it's the case? Because if you are marketing to people who want democracy, probably your work is pretty easy. But if these people don't believe in these ideas, it's something else. And another thing that is kind of okay to me while we were speaking is that there's a lot of tension right now in the idea of democracy, and the fact that everyone has an equal stake in the future of the country now is kind of challenged because of globalism, or because like before it was people with similar ideas, they founded a country and they were kind of like-minded, and now in Europe maybe it's because of immigration, in Israel maybe it's because of religion. Like for example, there's a person who never went to the army who is commanding who was sitting in jail and commanding the police forces, and maybe democracy is not the best way. Maybe like you have a credit score in the bank to get a loan, your past means something when you want to take a loan or to make a decision. So I would love to hear your thoughts on the situation right now, and if it says something about democracy and specifically the climate in the Middle East of trying to push democracy towards people that not necessarily want it.
Yeah. So fair question. So I'm not pushing democracy on anybody, me personally. I believe in democracy. I believe in accountable government and rule of law and checks and balances with all its imperfections, but I am a big believer in democracy. In the Middle East, you would know as well as I, it's complicated. Let me switch for a second to the colleague who comes from Ukraine. Russia today. It's not always popular in all circles to say this, but I don't think a majority of the Russian population today is interested or receptive to democracy. I don't think it's a genetic thing, actually, but I do think it's a cultural thing. And I think there are reasons, deep and complex, but it's a fact, that far too many people in Russia like Putin, like Putinism, and like the war in Ukraine. It's shocking, it's jarring, it's bitter, but I think it's true. If Putin dropped dead tomorrow, I don't think we have free elections and peace and flowers and all that sort of thing. So hold that thought. In the Middle East, for reasons of, I don't think it's a genetic thing, but for reasons of history and culture and practice, I don't think that many populations there are receptive to my definition of democracy. And in fact, if you look historically, democracy is really hard. It's institutions, it's systems, it's processes, it's habits, it's values, its behaviors. For us Americans, we can be a little bit self-critical. Democracy depends on things like accepting the result of elections, joining the loyal opposition, These are habits and values that are really central, and they can erode, and they can atrophy, and it takes a tremendous amount of work. Me, pathological optimist, I would like to think that there's a constituency. I can't tell you how large country by country, but there's a constituency for more pluralism, more tolerance, more respect for diversity. And whatever that constituency is, I would like to support and help grow it. Two, you didn't say Germany in the 1930s, but 1930s, Germany comes to mind. So this quote from Mark Twain. Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme a lot of the time. And there are rhymes today, just rhymes. But Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, it was, again, this unfortunate confluence of factors. Economic woes, grievance, issues of identity, exploitation by effective demagogues, and also, watch American and European politics, and maybe Israel too, incredible fragmentation and sectarianism. Everybody says about America, we're so polarized. That doesn't do justice to it. This is not just a red state, blue state issue any longer. Things are fragmenting, I think. Things are going more and more sectarian. What does that mean? Think about it for American politics when Liz Cheney, you know who she is, and her father, Dick Cheney, you know who he is, and you know how they've weighed in on this election, and you know what it means in the Republican Party? By the way, I'm a conservative person. I'm not a liberal left person. You know what it means in the Republican Party? It means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. It has absolutely zero influence. So what I want to say with that is, like the 1930s, there's grievance, there's demagogic exploitation, and there's suddenly this fragmentation and growing sectarianism. Even small countries like the Netherlands, you know how many parties they have in their parliament? 17. So democratic, everybody has a voice. Wait until it stops functioning, and people say it's not functioning. We need one party. I exaggerate, except we've been there before. What else, you all? Yes, sir.
I'd like advice. So, okay, I'd like advice. I'm a researcher, so my go-to position is to try to use logic and convince people. And a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, I was lamenting to one of my colleagues that say as far as anti-Semitism or perspectives on Israel, I haven't been able to convince anybody.
Yeah.
I feel like we go through the exercise and I'm making progress, and when I'm just about there, they say, well, it's terrible.
Yeah.
It's just the Jews are this, Jews are that. It's so obviously I'm doing the wrong approach. And through like your experience with broadcast, maybe one-on-one is different from when you're trying to reach whole populations. But do you have any guidance for trying to change people's perspectives?
Good heavens. I don't. I really don't. I'll tell you, I experienced the same thing. And I'll tell you, this is also bad. It's unhealthy. I started to self-censor myself. So we had dinner recently with neighbors, and it got into Gaza. It was a disastrous dinner. It was an absolute disaster because the perspectives were so widely varied. And then I was hearing from neighbors. This is in Washington, D.C., and educated and international, and everybody's been abroad and all that sort of thing. I was hearing that Israel was guilty of mass murder, that Palestinians were victims, that this was a horror unprecedented. And at one point I said, so I failed. I said, well, you ought to come to Middle East Broadcasting Networks. Everybody's working for me, comes to the region. And I'm not saying they love Israel. Don't worry about that. They have plenty of quarrels with Israel. But they do not share this view. And then these neighbors said, haven't you watched the television and seen the pictures? And then when I hear that, the conversation's over. What are we going to do? Well, here are the 3 reasons why the pictures you're looking at aren't fully. So I don't know. It's back to the narratives, these deeply, deeply entrenched narratives that then, and of course they think that about us. Look at me, us and them. But anyway, well, you know, he's just a mouthpiece for Israel or whatever that is, probably. But the narratives are so entrenched, I don't know how you move people. I don't. I'll tell you one thing I did. I'm not Jewish or Israeli, by the way. Can I still stay? Yeah. I was raised Roman Catholic. When I was running an institute...
You gotta pay for your dinner, that's all.
When I was running this institute in Berlin, I did this program, if I may say. It was very good. I took young German journalists, 20-something, 30-something, to Israel for a week, 3 or 4 times a year. And you know what we did? We just went to Israel. And we went into politics and technology and culture and culinary and the diversity and richness and volatility that is Israel. But because, lo and behold, many European journalists, lo and behold, they think that Israel is a tank with a little kid with a slingshot. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and I overstate a little bit for effect. And then I had one person say to me in Tel Aviv, German journalist from Der Spiegel, 30 years old, she says, oh my God, you could take holiday here. How about that? It's almost like a normal country, you know? Almost. You can eat a salad here too, you know? And look, that person smiled. Amazing. By the way, also, I did conference in Israel, back to with Arab participants. I did a conference, one in Israel, did a 2-part conference, Tel Aviv and Amman. And I had an young Egyptian academic, 29 years old, who in a cafe at the last night of the conference, I guess I do have some of an answer, but it's really long term, 29-year-old female academic from Cairo. And first she told me that before she left, the security services came, this is not Iran, by the way, it's Egypt, peace treaty. Some fashion with Israel, said security services came and interviewed me before my trip. They said they would require a debrief after my trip, and I had family members scolding me and even denouncing me for even going to Israel. And there she is, you know, in Israel after a 3-day conference with tears in her eyes. She's saying, oh my God, it looks so normal and inviting. I had no idea growing up in my family, my country, my system, my culture. So somehow it has to be the long game of what? Bringing, showing, telling, investing. But I have to say, it hasn't worked well yet, has it? I mean, I don't, why are we where we are?